Now we're going to take and shift our focus in the Mediterranean region to the Romans. And the Roman Empire or Roman civilization lasts for roughly 1,000 years, a little bit less than that, at least in terms of the way we think of it. It starts out as a republic, which we are well versed in due to the fact that we live in a republic, and eventually it's going to shift to an empire. And of course, an empire needs an emperor or a king or a leader of some kind that is not chosen by the people or representatives of the people. So we're going to see that, most historians date the shift of it from being a republic to an empire at the time of Julius Caesar. But in the Crash Course video you'll watch, or you've already watched, you'll notice that John Green makes the argument that, in fact, the empire had already existed well before it was technically an empire, or called an empire in name. So how does Rome come about? Well, you got the legend of Romulus and Remus, two twin brothers who were abandoned by their parents at the River Tiber. A she-wolf allegedly finds them, nurses them, shepherds them to adulthood, and as adults they found this city on 7 hills. Eventually Romulus kills Remus over a disagreement, and that's the legend of how Rome began. More likely you had Indo-European migrants rolling in around 2000 BCE. They're going to bring with them bronze knowledge in 1800, and then 900 years later, iron technology makes its way into the region as well, and that's going to become important for the Romans as they expand later on, that they have iron technology, which is going to be important for agriculture, of course, as well as their weapons. So Rome is technically founded in 753 BCE, and it is at first a kingdom. So they have a monarchy for a couple hundred years, and it's a pretty effective little city-state, basically, a little kingdom, nothing major. This is at the same time that the Greeks are starting to spring up themselves. As a matter of fact, some Greeks have moved to the Italian peninsula at this time and settled there. So it's nothing more than a small city-state or small kingdom that's part of the whole Mediterranean at this point in time. 509 BCE, the Etruscans, who were some of the people who had settled there, their last king is overthrown by the Roman people, and they establish a republic as their form of government. They show their acumen for building things. They were remarkable engineers, probably the best engineers of the ancient and classical world, and so they built the Roman Forum. They build a little later on aqueducts that are remarkable things. They have a great number of accomplishments that we'll talk about here. Politically, they write a constitution. They have 2 consuls, or like executives, who run, and they have a senate. So you see some similarities to our own government here. But of course you had the rich and the poor, as you can imagine. The consuls served only 1-year terms before they were replaced, and then they couldn't be consul again for another 10 years. As far as their social structure and social conflict went, you had patricians, who were the aristocrats, the wealthy landowners. If your name is Patrick, you are allegedly a patrician. The plebeians are the commoners, and of course they make up the vast majority of the civilization. And of course, by the 5th century, you have a major class conflict, much like we saw in Athens and some of the other Greek city-states. So to placate the plebeians, they're allowed to elect tribunes for representation with regard to the Senate. And so these rights are slowly expanded over a couple hundred years. There is also the idea of an appointment of a dictator. If the Roman Republic, if the Senate felt it was threatened, you could make someone a dictator for a period of 6 months in order to expedite decisions so that the safety of the Republic could be met. So one of the things that allowed the Romans to really expand beyond their small kingdom was that iron that I mentioned. The iron industry is going to blossom in the 5th and 4th centuries, and they do it with their military, thanks to the iron technology. And sometimes they conquered people with their military. Other times just the threat of the Roman legions was enough, or the incentives. Some of the things they would go to conquer someone, and they would basically be like, hey, we could kill you and enslave you, or you could become part of our growing republic. You could even have citizenship. You could have tax exemptions, trade privileges. And they were like, well, what do we got to do for all that? Well, they're like, well, give up, become part of us, provide soldiers and military support for the greater empire or the greater republic, and you can be part of it. And so the Romans sometimes didn't even have to lift a finger in order to conquer people, especially after their reputation for being rather successful militarily spread around the Mediterranean region. So eventually you have the Punic Wars, where the Romans actually did have to fight. It is basically 3 separate wars over about a 100-year period, and what the two sides were fighting over was Sicily, which on the map you can't see it too well here, but when you look at Italy, it looks like the boot, and then the little island down here that we always said was the soccer ball that was being kicked by the boot was Sicily. And Carthage, right here in North Africa, not too far away from the Romans, across the Mediterranean, both of them were competing over who should have the grain supply from Sicily. And so they fight a series of wars over this. The Romans defeat them in the first war. And this is what really springs the Romans forward to dominate all of the Mediterranean once they beat the Carthaginians. And by the Third Punic War, they defeat them so soundly that they destroyed their city. And it's said that they then, after they destroyed the city, that they put salt down across their entire territory so that nothing would ever grow there again. So when you have an empire, even though it wasn't technically an empire yet, at least it wasn't in name, as you expand, you are essentially an empire. And so this brings about problems, especially with land. It was a problem all the time, how you distributed the land. Well, they developed a large-scale agricultural system called latifundia. And the idea behind this is that you have these giant estates run by the aristocrats, and this is how they got wealthy. So basically the wealthy elites, especially the top military people, received the conquered land. As they conquered territory, they gave it to these people. And of course, people who owned small plots of land simply could not compete with that. And so by 146 BCE, you can see just how much territory they've taken over. They've reached into modern-day Spain. Of course, they took over Carthage. They own the major islands in the Mediterranean. They've expanded along the Adriatic Sea. They took over the Greeks, like I mentioned before, and even into modern-day Turkey. They took over the Ionian edge of Anatolia. So we come to Rome's civil war. Actually, there were many civil wars throughout Rome's history, but this is the one that's the most important because it brings about the actual Roman Empire. So, long story short, Gaius Marius takes over Rome in 87 BCE. He is displaced a few years later by Sulla. Gaius, by the way, happens to be Julius Caesar's uncle. Julius Caesar at this point in time is one of the great generals of the Roman Republic. And when Sulla takes over, Caesar is not particularly happy about that. And so he goes off into other parts of the Republic Empire and tries to expand it as well as gain some power for himself. So Sulla's reign of terror doesn't last too long. And so now we take a look at Caesar. He gets away, like I said, and super popular as far as a military general. victories in Gaul, which is modern-day France, cement his legacy. His army, his legions, so to speak, that he had under his control, they were loyal to him, not to Rome. And of course, this was always going to be a problem for Rome as it expanded. It's like, who are these people really loyal to? Most people in the Roman military, or even in the empire, never had even been to Italy, much less Rome itself. So the idea of being loyal to Rome was kind of an abstract concept. So long story short, and John Green does a good job in the video of explaining how this goes down, but basically Caesar is ordered to return to Rome to face penalty for various things, and he could come in and surrender, and he'd probably be exiled or maybe even executed, or he could, take some of those armies that are loyal to him and come and attack basically his own home country. And he decides to attack, and he goes and attacks Pompey, who was his rival at the time, and he wins. And when he wins, he's like, well, we're not doing things the way they used to be. I'm going to become dictator. And instead of that whole 6-month dictator stuff, he's going to become dictator for life. Now, he's able to be tremendously popular due to the fact that his military record speaks for itself. He takes care of his military, so the war veterans and other allies of his end up with land. So he redistributes the land, takes it away from some of the wealthy aristocrats, and so they're going to feel threatened. Major building projects helps to eliminate unemployment, and the far-flung provinces, people in that area also get citizenship. So to a lot of people, especially the common people, the plebeians, Caesar is a pretty positive thing. The aristocrats, not so much. And of course, some of you already know the story. Caesar is then assassinated. Taking his place is his nephew Augustus, who takes the name Caesar Augustus after. He was his nephew, but also his adopted son. Augustus means the anointed one. So Augustus has a rival, Mark Antony, and who was having an affair with Cleopatra in Egypt, and Augustus chases after him to attack him in Egypt. Mark Antony was already killed by that point in time, but he lays siege to the city and burns it to the ground, unfortunately, because the great Alexandrian library happened to be destroyed during that time. So he takes the title of Augustus in 27 BCE, and what you have there is a continuation of Julius Caesar's idea of a dictator, which essentially means that the Roman Republic is gone. It might still be called a republic at this time, but it is essentially gone. Under Augustus, like I say, it's a monarchy disguised as a republic. They still called it the Roman Republic, but it was gone. You were a dictator, you were a monarch. He was going to pass it on to his son, so on and so forth. So the empire is stable under him, but that's mainly because it's under threat of the military crushing any kind of rebellion and so forth. And as I mentioned before, the military was loyal to the emperor, not to, any concept of Rome. So Rome expands. Under Augustus, you see there in green. And then at the time of Hadrian, a little while later, they actually expand even further all the way up into Britain, as a matter of fact, and all the way in the western part of North Africa. So that's the height of the Roman Empire there. During this time, you see some of the key cities that we know later on emerge, like Paris, for example. So from 27 to 250 CE, we call this the Pax Romana, because this was the most peaceful time in the region. The Romans, even though their empire at this point in time might be beginning to see some signs of trouble and decay, especially politically, structurally, culturally, it was at its height during this time. So we'll cut this lesson off here, and in the next one we'll focus on Roman law a little bit, and we'll look at agriculture and society is patriarchy and all that stuff, slavery, and so on and so forth.